Welcome to Unsupervised Learning, Redpoint's AI podcast. Today we had an awesome episode with Erik Bernhardsson, the CEO and co-founder at Modal. Modal is one of our most recent investments in the AI space and what I think is one of the most exciting companies in data infrastructure and AI infrastructure. They were recently on the Information Top 50 Companies. In this episode, we talk with Erik about what Modal does, why it's an amazing developer experience, and then also just the broader AI ecosystem, how GPU prices affect the business, what's happening with the cloud vendors, open source versus closed source models, and much more. Thank you so much for joining us. Erik, thank you so much for joining us on Unsupervised Learning.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
You started Modal as a general compute platform. Basically anything a data team wanted to do, they could run on Modal. This is obviously still true, but over the last couple of years, Modal's really emerged as a great way of building generative AI applications. And so maybe just to start, what was your motivation for founding Modal? And did you expect that it would be such an amazing way of building kind of with generative AI when you first founded the company?
Well, GenAI barely existed back then. I don't think people talked about it. I don't know, maybe it did exist, but at least the term is to me pretty new. But yeah, so I started working on Modal end of 2020. Roughly. And my background is I've been working on data for most of my career. I was at Spotify for many years and built a music recommendation system in particular. So I spent a lot of time on large scale, like numerical methods and big data. And in general, I always felt like working with data was hard. And, mostly from personal experience, like I always wanted to, build better tools to work with data. I was fairly agnostic as to like where to start in the stack. I built a workflow engine called Luigi a million years ago at Spotify. So that was actually one of the things I thought a lot about is like, maybe I should build a better workflow engine. And then at some point, like researching that idea, I realized like, well, actually like you kind of have to run the code somewhere. Like that seems like a really hard problem. Like maybe I should do that instead. So decided to go a layer deeper in the stack and focus more on like, okay, it's hard to run code in the cloud. Like data teams seem to really struggle, in particular data teams, whatever they're using, like Kubernetes or whatever, like just the point of like, I have some ad hoc thing I want to like scale out, or I want to productionize a machine learning model, whatever it is, it's kind of hard. And so started working on that towards the end of 2020, pretty quickly realized like that's a hard thing. Like it's a hard infrastructure problem. Like I have to go down like very deep and like, like just a few months in, I realized like I kind of want to build my own file system actually, because I want to load containers very quickly. Like people that I was talking to back then, they're like, "You're nuts! Like just use like Kubernetes and Docker like everyone else." But like my feeling was always like, no. Like in order to have the user experience that I wanted, like I'm gonna have to rebuild those things. So it took a lot of time to do that, to rebuild a lot of that foundational infrastructure. And then about a year and a half in, so like around the summer last year, we built something we felt really excited about. Like we had this, product where like you can write code and you can launch it in the cloud and kind of just works. And we had support for all kinds of different features. We didn't really have any customers. So that's, so then we, started looking around, okay, like what are like the actual use cases? Like just like within a few months, like we started seeing a lot of people coming to Modal, looking for a way to deploy a lot of GenAI applications or a lot of GenAI models. And we realized there was something there. And I think what they saw in Modal was in particular, like we had GPU support, we could do things serverlessly, we were able to start containers very quickly. And in particular also, I think there's like a lot of people coming to machine learning or coming to AI that didn't really have sort of a traditional like bias towards existing tools. They just wanted to start from like a clean slate and like use something new. So we found a pretty good fit in that, and that's effectively now like what's been driving most of our revenue and growth. We do have some other customers, like we do have a bunch of people using us for like computational biotech or 3D rendering, web scraping, whatever. We're super excited like long-term to also like, focus on those use cases too. I think right now, like, effectively like, GenAI has been, it is like by far our biggest use case, but yeah, like we are building a general purpose platform still. So this is hopefully many other types of use cases in the future too.
I think it would be awesome maybe to just contextualize a little bit the different options that developers have today that want to run Llama or Stable Diffusion, and how do you think about kind of the set of options in front of them today?
I mean, obviously you can like roll it yourself, right? Like you can like run your own Kubernetes cluster and like spend like a few days like dealing with CUDA driver versions or whatever. and set up Kubernetes and like, on EC2 or Fargate or whatever, and like run it yourself. And I mean, some people do that. Like, first of all, it's like super annoying to do from a developer experience. Like, the other problem is it's also from a utilization point of view, it's actually like kind of expensive, right? Like GPUs are expensive. And so like like one of the benefits of Modal is it's all serverless. So you actually only pay for usage, which I think is like very beneficial when you're dealing with these like very expensive GPUs. Another option is there's a lot of providers out there that basically do like AI behind an API. And so replicate it with like there's a few other ones too. There's like zero customization. Like, so as soon as you have like your own proprietary model or your own proprietary like custom workflow, like now you still have to write code and I have to deploy it somewhere yourself. And so you're kind of back to square one. And so like, I think what Modal does is really well is like for custom code, like when you really need to do something custom, like you have your own custom models or you have, it's a complicated workflow. Like we solve that, and we also solve that in a serverless way. So you actually end up like lowering your costs pretty substantially. And we also do a much better developer experience. Like, so you don't have to like, as much as I love AWS, like I also like banging my head against AWS for like, probably like multiple person years at this point. Like, and like AWS is fantastic, but it's like incredibly frustrating to work with. So I think, we represent like a new way of building, cloud native AI applications in a certain sense that makes it a lot easier to work with.
I think it's really cool, just all the foundational technology that you guys have built. And you talked about building, container runtime and file system. Like, what is the, you talked a little bit about what that means, but I guess why do that? Like, what is the advantage that you can give developers because of the way that you've kind of architected Modal?
I think the main one like that we started with was just like, I wanted to make engineering teams or data teams more productive. And like, I thought a lot about like, what does that even mean? Like, like what's productivity? And like a lot of that, like to me, means like fast feedback loops. Like that's like when I feel happy is like when I write code and I have fast feedback loops. Totally. And also when I feel productive, like I think the best way to like understand developer productivity is actually like from the point of view of like you're iterating on code, like how quickly do you get feedback? And like working with the cloud is like super annoying because like traditionally, like if you had to like deploy, run something and like iterate on it in the cloud, like you have to like build a container and push it to the cloud and like go trigger something and then download logs or whatever. It's like super annoying. So to me, like, that basically like precludes you from like including the cloud in your day-to-day like developer feedback loop, and which is like for data like kind of bad because like I think there's a lot of reasons why like data teams actually kind of need to use the cloud in a lot of cases, like dealing with GPUs, for instance, or doing like ad hoc like scaling things out or whatever. Like you kind of want to use the cloud, right? Like you don't want to like have to go and buy a GPU machine and like deal like so like I started thinking about like what can you do to actually like take code and like launch it in the cloud in a way where like it basically feels like you're running things locally, but you're actually running things in Modal's environment in the cloud. In order to do that, you have to boot containers really quickly, for instance. And it turns out like you doing that with Kubernetes and Docker or traditional tools, there's no way you can get down to like a second or two, like taking code on someone's computer, building a container and launching that in the cloud, especially if you want to scale out or do all kinds of other stuff. Kubernetes is not optimized for like fast feedback loops. It's optimized for like run things at scale and handling a lot of requests, but that it doesn't work for this particular application. So the biggest reason was just like we wanted a fast feedback loop, and then later it turned out actually like for serverless stuff, actually it's kind of the same criteria. Like you want to be able to boot containers very quickly. It turns out it's like extremely useful for serverless, like Lambda style containers too. So they ended up having kind of two benefits in the end.
I remember in like the early days of Hadoop and Spark of like how brutal it would be to run a job in the cloud. It was like, okay, you would kick something off, then go get coffee and see the result. And like we've come so far from that, but it still is like Modal's really the first thing that I've seen that feels like it's local, right? Or you don't really care. It's just like it runs instantly and you get the result. And I think that kind of opens up a lot of opportunities for data people to build with it.
Have you seen any concentration in like some of these initial use cases?
Like definitely. I mean, I mentioned we do, a lot of our use cases are in GenAI, and I would say specifically we see most of the applications in audio, video, and images, like Stable Diffusion, like Dream Booth, like that kind of stuff. Like increasingly, like seeing like music generation, like audio pipelines, stuff like that. Less language models. I think that the reason is like just the best language model today is behind a proprietary API, right? Like OpenAI. And so for that reason, like people don't quite deploy language models like as much themselves. It's just hard to like, get the same performance. But we're starting to see like more and more people doing LLMs too on Modal. But I would say like in terms of revenue, like the main, like, the vast majority of it comes from like audio, video, image. And I would say also like inference. Like we focus a lot on like inference, which I think to me is like long-term, like where the money's going to be, and like, like where like most large-scale deployments, are going to be focused more on inference. We are starting to do more fine-tuning and a little bit of like doing training and like other types of stuff too. But definitely like inference right now is like where we see vast majority of applications.
Yeah, could you talk through just like some of the specific companies, like a Substack, or like you mentioned they're kind of in video or audio or those types of things, but like how one of those or Scale is using Modal, and maybe why it was a great fit for them? Yeah,
Substack, for instance, like they're doing various types of podcast transcriptions with Modal. So and like one of the things they like with Modal is like they can do this like fan out and use like Whisper to transcribe a lot of the audio very quickly. So you can take like an audio file and just like chop it up with small pieces and transcribe it in parallel. So that's pretty exciting. I think another example of like a company that I've been pretty excited about is there's a company called Suno that does music generation. And so they basically have a proprietary model running on Modal that like, you type in like, I want to have, I don't know, like a German hip hop song with bongo drums. And then it like generates that music using their own custom model, which is like, so there's a lot of like just really cool use cases that I see that, to me is like very exciting to play around with.
Yeah, it must be fun to see, going back to your Spotify days. I feel like, cool full circle there.
It's true, yeah. Yeah, it's actually funny because like there's another thing. Like I always thought of like Spotify, like the main thing with Spotify was like, you play the music, you double clicked on a track and you're like, wow, is this actually in the cloud? It's so fast, it feels local. And I always like feel like there's Modal's kind of.
I guess that's the unifying theme behind the work you do. I'm sure, obviously, Modal solves a bunch of problems for developers already, and I'm sure you look out at how the space is going to evolve over the decade and see a ton more problems that need to be solved on the developer side. And so, I'm wondering what you're seeing firsthand of like some of the pain points developers run into when they're working with some of these models, and how you think about how the kind of developer stack evolves.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like so many different like challenges like everywhere, right? Like dealing with just like CUDA drivers and like productionization and stuff like that. Plus the software stack is like incredibly immature. Like a lot of, Hugging Face or like, integrating that with Torch. Like there's just so many like janky ways where you end up having to call one Python script from another Python script in a sub process because there's no like, unified interface. Like everything around fine tuning is like based around like kind of janky frameworks, and like it's just, obviously like that will mature, but it's like, it's a pain today to like build, end-to-end pipelines using, some of these like Gen AI models, which is also why I think like Modal is exciting. Like we kind of help, people do that things. I think the cost is going to go down. Like it's going to get easier and easier to do it. But yeah, it is pretty significant right now. It's pretty annoying.
I'm curious how you kind of see the model layer of the stack evolving over time, or the models. Like there's kind of one camp, which is like one model to rule them all in the cloud. And then there's like open source for everything and, a bunch of different smaller models. Or maybe there's somewhere in between. Like, how do you see the kind of model layer evolving? Will models be commoditized, or like, what do you think will happen there?
Yeah, I mean, like I think like historically, if I look at like models and like open source and machine learning research in general, like I feel like the cutting edge stuff has always been kind of open. There's so many like tens of thousands of like machine learning researchers and like AI people like building things and sharing it. Like to me, like it feels like what we've seen in the last couple of years like has been a little bit of like a retraction from that. So like I do think that's going to revert back. Like I also think as it comes to like models, like. So like some people like they have like privacy concerns or like price or performance concerns. Like they're clearly like they're going to want to run like smaller models. In those cases, like like it's not going to be the sort of proprietary models like necessarily. Like it could be like smaller versions that's distilled or like fine tuned, or if they have like more data, they might want to like start with like a open source model and like fine tune it to like a specific domain. And then you look at like, the types of stuff that's left is like, like OpenAI or whatever. Like OpenAI, I feel like, or they clearly have the best model today. And like, kind of like I mentioned, like, like open source has always been where I feel like long-term, like the research happens. I do wonder what's going to happen with that. Like I because like so far, like, they've been able to build up their lead by like throwing like billions of dollars at like H100s and like hiring the best engineers in the world. But I always like wonder if it's like diminishing returns from that. And like, like Jan LeCun and other people have been like making good, compelling arguments for like maybe like open source will also take over it. Like, I don't know, like I think there's like a point where like I could also see like smarter model architectures, like, being like, there might be like much larger gains coming from that than from just like throwing like H100s at the problem. So I don't know, like I'm somewhat like, I don't know, maybe like somewhat naive and maybe like aspirationally, but like I would love for open source to be like the source of like the best models. I don't know, like fundamentally, like I do think that like if you have an unlimited budget, like obviously you will be able to train much larger models than anyone else. But I do think like OpenAI, like the delta is going to definitely shrink over time.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's fascinating because I do think the delta will shrink over time. And I think a lot of it comes down to how much better the models get with scale. Exactly. Because if they don't get much better, it's like for the same quality model, the cost is going down a ton for training and inference. But like if they do get a lot better with scale, then, maybe you would have to call a model with more compute in the cloud or one of OpenAI's models. And I think it'll be interesting to see if kind of those returns continue. You mentioned something that I thought was really interesting around the like GPUs and people having, thousands of GPUs that they can train on or run for inference. Like, what have you seen around GPU access and the dynamics in the market today? And how does that affect a startup like you guys that, are running workloads on GPUs?
I mean, like, I think like some of the headline news is true, right? Like it's hard to get H100s. And in particular, we've seen like sort of weird dynamics where like, normally in like function economics, like most economics, like the more GPUs you want, or like the more you want those X, like the lower price you get. It's kind of the opposite in the cloud. Like if you want like 1,000 GPUs, like the price actually goes up. Or most people say you have to go on like then like, go to different places and get them. So there's definitely like weirdness. Like that being said, like I kind of feel like it's like a little like overhyped. Like I feel like people are like obsessed with H100s, for instance. Like one of the things like, for instance, I'm pretty happy about is like that's actually freed up a lot of A100s. And A100s are like better price performance, in my opinion, for most use cases. We're also very like inference focused. So that means like we don't actually like the main GPU we use is A10s, which is kind of lower performance, but like per dollar, like very good performance and like more suited towards inference. We see less of a capacity shortage for those. Like it's relatively easy to get them in a couple of different cloud vendors. We've had to do like a bunch of tricks though. Like we've had to like build Modal in a multi-region, like to support multiple regions, for instance. Like, and part of that is like we see, like throughout the day, and like depending on like who's running things in different like regions. Like we see, like sometimes we have to go to Canada to get a bunch of like GPUs. Sometimes we have to go to Europe. Sometimes we can get them US East 1. And so there are some tricks like that we have to do in order to get the GPU capacity we need. But I do think like, I don't know, like my hope is like GPU prices will normalize. I think there will be more capacity. It's a little funky right now and maybe not quite as bad as like you might think reading, like some of the news. But it is a little funky.
Totally. And no, I mean, I think it makes sense, obviously, given the focus on inference, you guys have a bit more flexibility in the type of hardware you use. I'm curious, obviously, the costs of inference have been more in the news of late, and I think are constantly changing. And I'm wondering, like, where you think we are in kind of the optimization of inference costs for like this current set of models. Like, where do you think we end up as more and more folks are working on optimizing this, as a percent of like what they cost today to run, like, Llama or Stable Diffusion or some of these other models?
I don't know. I mean, I think like GPUs, like, they'll get like faster and faster every year. And I think people like optimize and like squeeze out more and more performance. But I also feel like there's like so much latent demand for a lot of this stuff. Like that, like, in the end, like, like when you make something more efficient, like does usage go up or go down? Like, or like total spend. Like, I don't know, like sometimes like lowering the price, like unleashes more. So like, I feel like, it might have the opposite effect. Like you might actually drive up the usage.
I think we're a long way from the efficient frontier. We'll see.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
This is a bit of an aside, but given your background, I thought it'd be interesting to ask you. You obviously built Annoy at Spotify, nearest neighbor vector search. With a lot of the generative AI workloads, like there's been a lot of attention around the kind of vector DBs and people running nearest neighbor to go get the, for RAG pipelines that they're going to go send to OpenAI. Do you have any thoughts on like the latest vector DB markets or the latest vector DB companies and, like how you see that layer of the stack evolving?
I'm incredibly bullish on vectors, and I've been that for a decade. Like I started dabbling with vectors in like 2008 or something like that, 2009 at Spotify. And like when I encountered it, I was like, this is obviously the way you should build music recommendations, because it's such a convenient way to think about items or like, things like abstractly. It's like you just have this like array of floating point numbers. And that turns out to be like super convenient, except for searching for nearest neighbors. And then I ended up building my own vector database back then in like C++ and used a bunch of tricks. And like, I talked to some VCs back then, like starting a company, like I just felt like it was like way too early, and I'm kind of glad I didn't do. And then like suddenly like, 2021 or 2022, like we went from like, like zero open source, almost like vector databases, like only Annoy essentially, to like, not suddenly there's like 25 startups doing this. I don't know, like I'm still extremely bullish on vectors as a whole. I do think like we're so early, and so like my general thought on that space is just like, I feel like when there's like a new technology like coming, like people's like gut reactions trying to shoehorn it into some old technology, and so like people look at vectors and they're like, yeah, it's a database, like we have to shoehorn it into like existing SQL databases. But I don't know, like actually like feel like when I look at vectors, like it represents a whole new way to like think about like information. And so I kind of suspect that the final incarnation of like vector databases will look nothing like a traditional database. Like it would like something very different. Like I don't know what the interface looks like. Do you put in like vectors into it? Like I don't know, like maybe you put in like text and image, but then on the other hand, you need to think about like embeddings yourself. Like, you need to pick an embedding model. Like I don't know, but like maybe like the embedding model should like, like do the vector like representation itself. Like I don't know. I think there's just so many like different things that we still haven't figured out. So, and I think that's ahead of us. And so like my feeling is like vector databases today look a lot like databases 10 years ago. I think vector databases in 10 years, like they will look nothing like that.
One thing I'm broadly curious about is, obviously I feel like you've built and been at the forefront of a lot of really interesting infrastructure and kind of improvements to developer experience. And now you have this front row seat to all the stuff that's getting done with GenAI. Like, how do you think generally these tools are going to impact like developer experience going forward?
I don't know. Maybe I'm like old, but like I'm actually not like, convinced like GenAI is like like I do think like developer experience will change a lot, but I think it's going to change a lot more from cloud. Like I think we're still like relatively early in like cloud adoption, especially like developers. So like, like when you're writing code today, like you like most people still do it locally, which is like kind of funny because like every single other profession has like effectively moved their entire workflow to the cloud, but developers haven't. So I think that's kind of funny, but I don't know about like GenAI. Like, obviously, like I think like GenAI can like help us like do like tab completion better, like and stuff like that, and I think that's like very valuable. But I think it's like valuable in the sense that like it's not going to like double developer productivity. I think when you look at like developer productivity, like historically over the last like a few decades, like we've gotten more productive, like through like a series of like 10% improvements, right? Like but they add up on a logarithmic scale, right? Like if you do like if you have like 50 improvements that are each like 10%, like suddenly you have like I don't know like multiple orders of magnitude in total, right? So like I like that's the kind of feeling I get when I look at like GenAI for developers. It's like, yeah, maybe it'll like make engineers like 10% more productive, maybe 20%, maybe 30%. It's nowhere near like 10x. But like it's still good. Like all these things add up.
I think it's really interesting, and you were talking about kind of the development in the cloud and what that means for developers going forward. And I think one thing that was awesome was you wrote this post years ago, kind of the storm in the stratosphere, how the cloud will be reshuffled. And I won't do this justice, but kind of the oversimplification that I think of in my mind is like developers are going to be interacting with services built on top of the cloud, not the cloud themselves. And I think that's really played out over the last kind of couple years, as things like Snowflake and Vercel and others have taken off. And I think of Modal as one of those for data teams. So like, I guess, why would you say that we are so early in our kind of cloud adoption, and what does kind of the future of cloud seem like to you?
Yeah, I think part of it is like kind of what I mentioned, like engineers like still write code as if the cloud doesn't exist. Like we deploy code into the cloud, but like a lot of like how we build software, like pretend like it's like as if the cloud doesn't exist at all, right? Like a lot of the developer workflow doesn't exist in the cloud. Like one particular example is that, like when you work with the cloud, like there's often like proprietary things. Like let's say you're like writing something to run on Lambda, right? Like Lambda doesn't have a mocking framework. So in order to like run code locally, like you basically have to like mock out Lambda yourself. And there's a bunch of frameworks that do that, but fundamentally now like you have like this like big rift between like your like local development workflow and the like cloud development workflow. And so, but so like I used to think that like, well, what if we take like everything in the cloud and like mock it out locally, then you can sort of do that. And then like people do that instead of using RDS, which is like a hosted Postgres in AWS. Like people just like run Postgres in a Docker container, whatever. But then I realized at some point, like, what if you just like have this ability to like run like ephemeral, like, short-lived objects? Like, what if you can just like create a database in the cloud and have it only exist for like a few seconds and like run all your tests against it and then like tear it down, whatever. Like, what if you actually like can bring the cloud into your local development workflow, like sort of, iteration cycle, right? Like, and in that case, like, there's no like difference between local and like it's the same environment, right? And you solve all this like agony of like switching between different environments, deploying things, etc. But like, like we're talking about Modal, like obviously like this is like what Modal is for data teams, right? Like, so I think that like that to me is like represents like some way of like how I think about the future of like the cloud and how we use it as developers. Is that like, to me, all development will move into the cloud eventually. Modal is sort of like how I envision that like happening for data teams specifically. And I think you see that across like other domains too. Like you look at like how people work with Snowflake or other domains, or how other tools are basically like abstracting out the underlying like compute layers and like, offering like a higher level service. Like I love AWS, like it's tremendous. Like the amount of things I can build with AWS, it's crazy, like how much value it brings to me. But it's also like from a developer experience point of view, like so bad. Like it's like just, and it's like they had 15 years to figure this out. Like I just don't think they're actually like fundamentally interested, and like I actually don't think they like care. Like it's like they make so much money just being a compute provider, and that's just sort of like where I like long term see. Like people used to say like, oh well, just doing compute is like pure commodity. Like they have to go up the software layer and like do more like stuff higher up. But I actually don't think that's true. Like AWS is like incredibly good margins in just pure compute. So like what I see is like a stable oligopoly of like a few hyperscalers doing incredibly well, offering like compute at scale, which is an incredibly hard problem. And then on top of that, like higher level services that offer like true like developer experience around like, writing code, deploying code, and maybe do that focusing on more specific use cases and workflows. Because I think that makes it a lot easier to build those cases. Like AWS like has to build for everyone at the same time, and that's much harder. If you're Vercel, you can focus on a particular workflow. If you're Modal, too. So I think that, that's sort of like, I guess, like part of my blog post in a nutshell.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the 2 points that really stick out to me are, one, the cloud business is quite good if you're, just running storage and compute. And then two, like the AWSs of the world, they have to build for everyone. They're building for data teams and front end and back end and all of those experiences in one. Definitely leaves something to be desired. And it is kind of crazy that with all of the advancements in like cloud computing and all of this stuff, most development still doesn't happen in the cloud, right? It's like people don't iterate in the cloud. They build locally and then figure out a way to get it into the cloud, maybe via Docker or via something else. So,
which is funny because if you go to like whatever, like a dentist, like all their workflows have moved to the cloud.
Yeah.
Like, or like pick any profession today, like everything happens in the cloud except for software engineering today.
Never thought I'd be behind the looking back at the dental industry ahead, but so it goes sometimes.
They're ahead in cloud adoption.
I guess it's interesting. You kind of mentioned the stable oligopoly on the cloud side, and obviously one thing that can potentially cause a shift in those dynamics is, these AI workloads, right? And I think it's been interesting to see the early days of kind of the cloud companies and their strategies, toward kind of getting a lot of that volume. But I'm curious, like, how you think their strategies evolve over time, and like, what role you ultimately see them playing.
I'm very bullish on the big 3, maybe 4, however you want to count, like hyperscalers. I just think there's like such enormous like economies of scale and like, benefits of like building hard technology and like running like, the capital investment that it takes to build, data centers. That being said, like there is sort of a weird thing happening right now where like, NVIDIA versus, AWS versus GCP, where like, GCP and AWS have their own chips and like, and there's some like weird kind of beef going on where like, maybe they don't get enough like NVIDIA GPUs. And then suddenly like CoreWeave comes from nowhere and like, which seems like kind of incredible to me, like, but like what they pulled off, like suddenly that's like, looks like a pretty sizable, like cloud vendor coming from nowhere. So I don't know. There's definitely some like interesting stuff happening on the GPU stuff. I am very like overall in the long run, like I am like very bullish on like just like AWS, GCP, and Azure, and maybe Oracle. Frankly, actually, like Oracle also kind of came back from the dead. I think we actually used Oracle at Modal and pretty happy customers. Like it kind of surprised me to say that, but it's actually a pretty good service, Oracle Cloud. But all in all, like this isn't a business that favors scale and favors, very high capital investments. It's a tough business. Like it's not going to be a lot of players in this space long term.
I'd actually be curious to get your perspective on Oracle Cloud. It seems like they have partnered with a lot of kind of AI type companies or companies running GPU type workflows. Like what's been your experience working with them?
I think they're great, right? Like, and I don't know under the hood. Like maybe they're bleeding money to like gain market share. Like I don't know, but like like what we see is like great prices. I think they definitely benefit from taking a more neutral stance versus with NVIDIA versus AWS and GCP, which are trying to do their own chips, which like obviously like from NVIDIA's point of view, like that's not good. I think Oracle benefits from that, like having a more like being on better terms with NVIDIA. Because like if you want like H100s or A100s, like Oracle seems to be a relatively good place to get those.
Yeah, and I'm curious, as obviously as the hyperscalers kind of fight to differentiate and win some of this business. I mean, obviously there's potentially building their own chips. There's certainly close ties with certain closed source foundation model companies. But how else do you think they end up trying to differentiate or kind of what are you seeing today around the difference in the offerings?
There's definitely like nuances. Like I don't know if there's like in the grand scheme of things, like at the end of the day, I'm relatively like just like the problem of like doing compute at a large scale. My feeling is like that's like a hard enough problem that like you almost like need no differentiation like on top of that. Like I am sort of skeptical of the idea that like in order to be a successful hyperscaler, you need to have a data warehouse. You need to have like blah, 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 blah. Like I actually don't know if you need that. Like CoreWeave seems to be doing like, okay, like entering the market without those things. But like, I think you need a lot of scale and I think you need a lot of, compute and, like you definitely need like, some software. You need a storage system like S3. You need a, compute system like EC2. And those are very hard problems. Like in terms of like how they differentiate like long-term, my feeling is like what I want to see is obviously like I want to see more diversity in terms of GPU vendors. Like I have a dream that like I can wake up, like in like a few years, like waking up in a world where like there's like multiple GPU vendors, like maybe AWS, like, finally figure out how to, run inference and Trainium with like good torch support, TPUs like too. I would love it if like AMD has like a few, maybe there's like some like wildcard vendor also like figuring it out. Like I think the world would benefit from that because like I think the world benefits from like cheap compute at large scale. I don't know. Like I've been saying this for like 5-10 years though, that like NVIDIA is going to have much more competition next year and it doesn't seem to happen. So like clearly NVIDIA is doing a phenomenal job staying ahead of their competitors. But I do think, at some point, I definitely would love to see that. And I think eventually it will happen.
How opinionated do you find kind of Modal users are when it comes to the GPUs or the compute that they're workflows are running on? Is it like, okay, if you run it at scale, it's totally fine, or like I want to run it on H100 because I have a specific thing about something that's happening?
I think they're actually fairly unopinionated, and I think that's good. Like I actually kind of like think we're actually putting a little bit too much of an onus on them to like pick a GPU. Like I would love to have some sort of automated like GPU selection mechanism where we just like automatically run people's code on like different GPUs and then kind of, you know, continuously, like either you can optimize for like maybe lowest latency or just like lowest cost. And we just like automatically do that. Because it is sort of an annoying, you know, a vector to have to think about when you're deploying code. Should you use A10s? Should you use T4, L10, like whatever, L4s, P4s, like A40s, A100, H1, you know, there's so many different GPUs. It would be nice if there's sort of more simple way to select the GPU.
Totally. And that's like the dream as a developer is you can kind of, you write your code and then you specify kind of the scale that you need and the cost that you're willing to pay. And then you don't have to think about anything else, right?
Exactly. And I think like when I think about like CPUs, like you don't really think about like whether you're like, you know, cloud CPU is like 3.2 gigahertz or like 3.6 gigahertz. And, you know, like maybe you think a little bit like about like how many cores it has. You might think about how much RAM it has. But like I feel like, you know, CPUs have come to a point where like you don't really care that much, and GPUs is going to take a long time to get there. But at least like maybe Modal can make it a little bit easier.
I mean, one thing I think is fascinating about your history is obviously, you know, you started to solve, you know, kind of these specific infrastructure problems, and then have kind of moved in, you know, just by user demand into this Gen AI space. I'm curious, like, was it immediately, as these models gained popularity, was it like immediately obvious to you? You're like, yeah, like Modal is clearly going to be an amazing place to run this. Or was it like some users that came in initially and started using Modal for these use cases? Like, what was that like early days of realizing like, hey, this actually might be a pretty big chunk of the platform?
I was kind of skeptical for a long time about like model deployment. Like I always felt like model deployment is like the easiest part. Cause like looking back, like, you know, the sort of traditional model deployment, like often you had like very complex feature pipelines or like complex like training, you know, requirements. And often like when you look at like, you know, traditional like simple models that cost, you know, like the most models that like say an e-commerce company, whatever, like you have like some very complex like feature pipeline, but the model itself is usually like fairly small. It's like XGBoost, like you just like dump it on S3 and you have some like simple Kubernetes thing that just like loads that model and like expose. And so when people started asking about like, well, can I do like model deployment on Modal? Like I was like skeptical. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like it feels like a relatively undifferentiated industry. But then we started realizing like there's actually like a couple of things that have completely changed. Like first of all, like for a lot of these models, like you need GPUs. Second of all is like you need serverless because it's like very expensive to run these models at scale. And then like there's actually a lot less of the sort of production pipeline stuff around like feature pipelines, training, like all of that stuff. We want to do those eventually too. Like definitely like want to like own the whole ecosystem. But a lot of the like what happened with like GenAI models is like it's just a model. It's just like code like comes in a box. It already has all the weights. Like all you need to, but however, these models are very large and they need to run on a GPU, and that's a hard problem. And so, but it's like a compute only problem. It's like, you know, it's like whereas like previously machine learning tend to be like very complicated around like state management, but like Stable Diffusion is like it's just like a pure compute problem. And so we realized it's actually quite well suited for that reason. But that took me a little bit of time to realize. I think, you know, initially, like I was thinking a lot about like Modal as like sort of a Kubernetes replacement, which I still think, you know, long-term, like that's what I want to build. But it turns out like the first killer use case was really serverless GPU inference.
Well, one thing I definitely want to make sure to get your thoughts on too is I feel like you obviously, you know, earlier in your career at Spotify worked a lot on like music recommendations and some really cool like early, you know, use cases in the space. I met, you know, your former employer has done a lot of cool things in generative AI these days. And I'm curious, like if you were still there, what are some of the things you'd be thinking about or potentially building there?
I mean, I think the craziest thing would be to just like generate music. Like, yeah, you know, and I was actually like, I've been thinking about that. Like, I actually feel like music is like kind of more of a pure art form in the sense that there's like no metadata almost. like when you look at like paintings, like it's often like, oh, like you need to know the story of the artist, or whatever, to truly appreciate it. But like music is like, it's just like waveforms that goes into your brain, and then it's either good or bad. So like to me, that's like the perfect setting for like Gen AI. Like I actually feel like, if I had to pick an art form where we're going to see like the greatest prevalence of like, AI generated content, like I would actually pick music. Like and I think we're going to see it in the next couple of years more and more. I don't think we're going to see like purely AI generated initially. I think it's going to be more like, like good producers and good artists are going to figure out how to use AI technologies to the benefit for making music. But so it's that would be, but like, but also if I was Spotify, like I would maybe start to think about like, well, we're paying a lot of money in royalties. Like, can we actually substitute that with like automatically generated music? I don't know. Like, it's kind of a crazy idea, because I also feel like music is kind of like a social thing. Like, you want to know that your friends are listening to the same track, so you can talk about, so there's a little bit of that aspect that I think is like would be lost, that I think is hard to replace. But I don't know. Like, I'm kind of excited about the prospect of like AI generated music, actually.
I also think if Spotify were to get disrupted, that generative AI music is probably one of the biggest vectors that someone could go down. Like, I could imagine there being some sort of, I don't know, Gen AI music social network where, you, me, and Jacob are creating a song together, and then we can share that with our friends and each kind of riff on it and add things to it. I really think that will exist. And in that world, it's like, I'm sure there'll still be a market for the, Taylor Swifts of the world. But I do think a lot of kind of creation moving to people, individuals and consumers, could be an interesting trend.
Totally. And it's like funny, like music tends to be also like kind of like the first carrier of like new technology in many cases. Like, I feel like Steve Jobs has talked about that. You go back to like Kraftwerk, like they talked about that. Like, music is like carrier of new ideas. Like it's often like the first place, I guess, music and porn. But music tends to be like one of the first places where like new technologies really come to light. With the cloud, like I think it happened pretty early with Spotify.
Yeah, and all these people creating their own generative music now have easy infrastructure to do it with, right? So all the easier to do.
Awesome. Well, we'd love to move to a quick fire round if that is cool. What is one thing that is overhyped in AI and one thing that is underhyped in AI?
Overhyped? I don't know. Like, I actually kind of, I don't know if it's overhyped. Like, I feel like Transformers, like I kind of want them to go away, because like I don't know, it feels like weird to me. Like, I feel like we're like, confusing, like we want to learn like a model of the world and like encode that as like facts with like the language model itself, which seems to be like more like a decode, like you just want to like read things. I don't know, like to me, like maybe I'm also like annoyed because like I stopped following like machine learning research like around the same time the Transformer paper came out. So if like people moved away from Transformers, I would have a chance to actually like start over and like learn everything. But like I would love to like like I feel like there's going to be like a paradigm shift at some point, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah. Aren't Transformers kind of good for business, though, with the relatively high inference costs?
I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think whatever we're going to find probably will also have high inference costs. It tends to be that way.
It is very surprising to me that there would be one architecture that is so good at so much. Like I feel like people will discover new types of architectures that will be kind of good, or the next iteration over time.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, second one. What is one thing you wished you knew when starting Modal that you know now?
Okay, that's a good question. I think like probably like my biggest mistake the first year was like, I thought it would be easier to go to big companies and say, hey, you're using Kubernetes and you have this like internal data platform. Actually, you should rip that out and replace it with Modal. Like, it turns out it's much harder to tell people to switch technologies than it is to people to adopt technologies from scratch. And I think that was like a realization we made a year or two in that made it so much easier to think about, okay, like where should we start to sell?
Anything you've learned about like, selling to AI people, within these companies that you feel like you've gotten better at, since starting?
I think one thing I see a lot of like enterprise companies is that there's often like kind of a weird split. Not weird, actually, it's going to make sense, but like there's like a complex split between like platform teams and like people actually doing the AI. And they often like say very different things. Like, you go to the AI team, they're like, yeah, like our platform is like crap. It's so hard to iterate. Like, it's like, I can't get anything into production. And then you go to the platform team, they're like, yeah, like we have like a great system we built internally. Like it works. Like, everyone can ship things in production. It's really easy. You just need to like define this YAML stuff and then, run these 5 commands and then go to Github, So there's like a big rift and like, you kind of need to sell to both of those people at the same time, I think, a little bit in order to do. I'm like slowly learning about enterprise sales. I'm not an expert by any means, but like, those are some of the challenges we've seen with like enterprise, like selling to, selling to tech teams.
Totally makes sense. And then to close out, where can people go to, follow your progress with Modal or learn more about what you're building?
Modal.com is probably the best place. So modal.com. I'm also like somewhat active on Twitter. I tend to post a lot. So it's just like Bernhardsson, like my last name is my handle. You can always like follow me, like posting stuff. But yeah, modal.com is probably the best place to get started with Modal and follow our progress.
Awesome. Well, Erik, thank you so much for joining us on Unsupervised Learning. This was really fun and always fun to have someone in the Redpoint family on the podcast. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome. It's great being here. Thank you.
Well, I thought it was super fun to have Erik on the podcast. He's such an interesting dude in that he can be down in the weeds and writing code, but then also zoom out to what's happening at the, in the markets and cloud and AI and all that stuff. And so it's cool to get his perspective on, everything from the developer experience up to like who is going to win in generative AI.
Yeah, he is so smart. I'm glad he's on our side in the portfolio.
Oh my God, there's so much that I get to learn from him and that everyone can. So yeah, I agree
totally. And I love how I love that this is like two things. I love one that this is like a byproduct of a solution that he was building for non-generative AI reasons at all. And I love at the end when he was like, I still want to take out Kubernetes. Like, it's like even he's going to build a massive business doing this, but like I still also like down the line I'm going to do the original goal as well. And like this is kind of a step on the way, which is really funny.
Yeah, I love the example that he gave around Spotify and how when you're playing a song on Spotify, it's from the cloud, but it feels like it's local. And in some ways, there's some parallels to Modal where it is in the cloud, but it's so fast that it feels like it's local. And
yeah, there's not many times I hear that like software development is behind dentistry in terms of any sort of technology. But I think it was I think there's clear reasons why, and I feel like it just seems like such a seamless experience using Modal. It's a really cool tool. I don't know if I tell it's funny. He was talking about the music stuff, and I feel like people would take offense with the idea that like the context behind the music does not matter at all, and it is purely like the output. I feel like everyone knowing Taylor Swift's latest breakup just makes that Taylor Swift song like hit so much harder. But
that is true. You know that it's about Jake Gyllenhaal, and then you're like, oh, we are never, ever, ever getting back together. Rashad,
and see, in no, but that has to stay. In a world of AI generated music, we never get that because you'd like just use someone else's voice or something, and we never have the pleasure of your karaoke there.
The story it does matter a lot though. I don't know. I think about like some of the great songs that I really like. It seems like the story matters a little bit, but maybe not. I think there is. And it's also one thing that was cool is just to hear about all the different types of applications that people are building on Modal, where it's like, Substack using Whisper for their podcast stuff and running that on Modal, but also people doing protein folding and just the wide range of applications.
Don't forget Ramp, Redpoint Porco. Always have to shout out them.
There you go. Well, you're also a healthcare guy. I thought you might like the protein folding.
I do. I love Ramp. I love protein folding. It's all up the alley. I mean, I do. This is like clearly A+ company. Like, how did this come about? Like, how did how did we get the chance to work with these folks?
I mean, it was like a year-long process where we had met Erik, and then we tried Modal, and then we were trying to convince him to raise in the fall, and then he kept pushing us off, and then a year later, the timing was right, but it was a long, slow burn.
I assume you sung him that Taylor Swift song, and that was what pushed him over the edge.
It was interesting. You were asking about the process and how smart Erik is. There were 2 references that stuck out to me when we did a bunch of references on him, and one was like dude, if you have the opportunity to write the check, just do it. It was someone that had worked with him at Spotify. And then there was another one that was like, Erik is actually a hyper genius, like one of the smartest people that I've ever met.
It's clear. You could tell even from just the stuff. Like, I love that he casually built one of the first, vector data, like
I know it was
solutions.
Like before they were cool too.
I feel like there's probably 30 companies that could have been built, at various times with things that he's done, and it's awesome that this is kind of where he decided to focus.
I was surprised at how much he was raving about Oracle's cloud experience. We knew obviously that they were on Oracle and that a bunch of companies were using them for GPUs and to run AI workflows, but I thought it was kind of interesting to hear about that he had so much praise for Oracle's cloud product.
Yeah, and I just love that. I do think transformer architectures are objectively good for his business given the high inference costs. But I love that he's like, I wish we just move on we find some new architecture. I think he's just so clearly loves technology, and is he's fantastic. And I think it was a really interesting time to have him on, right? Obviously, there's been, a bunch of raises in kind of this like model inference space. I mean, I think most notably Together, which, raised a round from Kleiner and then, is rumored to have raised more money from Emergence. And, we've seen a whole host of other folks like Replicate and Anyscale and Fireworks. And I think it's clearly the space is clearly incredibly interesting for investors right now. And, I think there's obviously, the types of models that get run, the optimizations that get run on inference, but then also I think what makes Modal so unique is the ability to kind of be able to, actually do far more than just bring your model and run inference. And I think it's just such a complete developer tool. It's part of what makes it so interesting.
Totally. Yeah, I think that was a big reason why we got so excited about Modal was that they can do inference. It's great for that, but also there's an incredible developer experience to do all of the things that a data team would want to do. And Erik touched on that in the episode of if you just want to deploy a model, there's other ways that you can do that. But if you want to, do some data transformation or do some customization and then do something else and then run that model at infinite scale without managing any infrastructure yourself, then Modal is a pretty good platform to do that kind of end to end. And I think that's, from an investor perspective, something that we got really excited about because you can own, there's model hosting, but I think there's an opportunity if you own the whole pipeline to layer on a bunch of higher margin businesses and product lines over time. And I think that's one of the cool things about Modal was that they are end to end.
Totally. But it's such a great wedge, right? Like everybody needs some sort of access to compute. Nobody wants to run this themselves. I mean, I think, what we see with these AI applications that launch, it's like you have no idea if anyone's going to use it or the entire world's going to use it. And the pace at which these applications can scale, you need someone that's flexible on the back end with compute.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's sweet about Modal is you can go build your AI app and not worry about any infrastructure. If it takes off, then you're totally fine, right? If you're the next Lenza or whatever, or if you're running at large scale already, like a Ramp or Substack or whatever. I think that's, I don't know, the engineer in me gets really excited about that. And we actually, we ran a bunch of stuff on Modal before we invested. Almost a year before we invested, we built some flows to scrape Hacker News and do a bunch of things. And it's it's so nice to just write Python and not have to worry about any infrastructure. It just runs on a cadence.
I remember when you did that. That was awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
I feel like your signature line is, usually I feel like every pitch we're on, you're like, I don't write code anymore. I write emails. But then, you were back to it then.
I know. I had to dust off the old keyboard and write some Python.